My name is William Grant, and I stopped fishing Loch Ness on the night of September 23, 1968. Not because I wanted to, fishing was all I knew, all I'd ever done, all my family had done for 5 generations. But because after what I saw that night, after what happened in those dark hours between midnight and dawn, I couldn't bring myself to set foot on those waters again. I'm 79 years old now, sitting in my cottage in Invermariston, looking out at the loch from a safe distance, recording this testimony because my doctor says I have perhaps 6 months left. Cancer. The kind that doesn't care how tough you think you are or how many storms you've survived. It's taking me piece by piece, and before it finishes the job, I need someone to know what really happened that night. Not the version I told the police. Not the story I gave my wife to explain why I came home at dawn, soaking wet and shaking so badly I couldn't hold a cup of tea. The truth. The whole truth. The thing I've been too frightened to speak about for 56 years. I was 33 years old in 1968, married to Catherine for 8 years, with 2 young sons who needed feeding and a boat that needed payments. September was always a good month for fishing, the tourists thinning out, the water cooling, the fish moving into shallower waters where the nets could reach them. I'd been working 12-hour days, sometimes longer, trying to build up stock before winter set in. That night, I'd gone out later than usual. A big order had come in from a hotel in Fort Augustus. They needed fresh fish for some event they were hosting, willing to pay premium prices for next-day delivery. The money was too good to refuse, even though it meant fishing after dark, which I normally avoided. My father had always warned me about night fishing on Loch Ness. The loch changes after sunset, he'd say, his face serious in the way it rarely was. Things move in the deep water. Things that don't like to be disturbed. You fish during the day, boy. You leave the nights to whatever claims them. I'd thought it was superstition. Old fishermen's tales to keep young men cautious. But my father had been a practical man otherwise, not given to flights of fancy or meaningless warnings. And he'd stopped fishing the loch entirely after some incident he refused to discuss, something that had happened on a night fishing trip when he was about my age. I should have listened to him. Should have turned down the premium money and stuck to daylight hours. But I was young and confident and convinced I knew better than the old-timers with their stories and their fears. If you're listening to this, if you found this recording, then you need to understand something from the start. What I'm about to tell you is not a legend. Not a story. Not a hoax or a hallucination or a misidentification. This is what happened to me on the night of September 23, 1968, on Loch Ness, in the deep water near Urquhart Castle. And it changed everything. Subscribe to this channel if you're ready to hear the truth. Hit that like button if you believe some encounters can never be explained away. Share this with people who understand that the darkness hides things we're better off not seeing. I left the dock at Invermariston at 11 p.m., motoring out into darkness so complete it felt physical. No moon that night, heavy cloud cover that blotted out even the stars. Just my boat's running lights cutting through the black, and the dim glow of the villages scattered along the shoreline, growing fainter as I headed toward the deeper water. The loch was unnaturally still. Not a breath of wind, not a ripple on the surface. Just flat, black water that reflected nothing, that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. I remember thinking it was perfect fishing weather, the kind of calm that made net work easy and catches plentiful. I reached my usual spot around midnight. Cut the engine. Let the boat drift while I prepared the nets. The silence was absolute. No sounds from shore, no boats in the distance, no birds or wind or water lapping against the hull. Just silence so deep it made my ears ring. I should have recognized that silence for what it was. A warning. The kind of unnatural quiet that settles over a place when predators are near, when prey animals freeze and wait and hope not to be noticed. But I didn't recognize it. I just set my nets and waited for the fish to come. They never did. I'd been fishing Loch Ness for 15 years by 1968. I knew its rhythms, its patterns, its moods. I knew where the fish congregated and when they fed and how long it took for nets to fill in different conditions. In that spot, on a calm September night, I should have been pulling up salmon within an hour. But the net stayed empty. I checked them after 45 minutes. Nothing. Not even the small fish that usually appeared first. Just empty nets, clean as if they'd never been in the water at all. I repositioned. Tried a different depth. Different angle. Different arrangement. Still nothing. It was as if every fish in the loch had vanished, had been scared away by something I couldn't see or hear or sense. That's when I noticed the water. It had started moving. Not from wind, the air was still dead calm. Not from current, the loch doesn't have significant currents in the deep water. But moving nonetheless. Small swells passing under the boat, rhythmic and regular, like the breathing of something massive. I stood in the bow with my flashlight, shining it down into the water, trying to see what was causing the movement. The beam penetrated perhaps 2 meters before being swallowed by the murky darkness. I couldn't see the bottom. Couldn't see anything beyond that shallow cone of light. But I could feel something. A presence. The way you feel when someone's watching you from across a room, even though you haven't seen them yet. That prickling on the back of your neck. That certainty that you're not alone. The swells grew larger. The boat began to rock, gently at first, then more noticeably. I grabbed the gunwale to steady myself, my flashlight beam dancing across the water, and that's when I saw it. A shape. Deep in the water, just at the edge of visibility. Large. Moving. Passing beneath my boat with ponderous grace. I'm not ashamed to say I was terrified. Whatever was down there was big enough to create swells that lifted my 6-meter boat like a toy. Big enough that I could sense its passage through the water, could feel the displacement, could track its movement by watching how the surface responded. I grabbed for the engine key. Needed to start it up, needed to get away from whatever was circling below me. But my hands were shaking so badly I dropped the key. Heard it clatter across the deck, roll, and disappear into the darkness near the stern. And that's when the creature surfaced. It came up slowly, deliberately, in a way that suggested it knew exactly where I was and what I was doing. The water began to dome upward perhaps 10 meters from the bow, rising smoothly, almost gently. And then the head broke the surface. I'd heard the stories all my life. The monster of Loch Ness. The creature that tourists came to see and locals pretended to believe in for the sake of tourism revenue. I dismissed it as legend, as hoax, as misidentification of logs and waves and seals. But there was no dismissing what I was looking at. The neck was perhaps 4 meters long, thick as a barrel at the base, tapering to a narrow skull that was reptilian but not quite snake-like. The skin was dark, black or very dark gray, and even in the dim light from my flashlight, I could see it was covered in patterns, markings, scars that suggested great age. But it was the eyes that froze me in place. Large, positioned forward on the skull like a predator's, and filled with an intelligence that made my stomach clench with instinctive fear. This wasn't an animal. Not in any simple sense. This was something else. The creature raised its head higher, water streaming off its neck, and looked directly at me. We locked eyes across 10 meters of dark water, and I understood with absolute clarity that it was assessing me. Deciding. Considering whether I was a threat, prey, or something else entirely. I stood frozen in the bow of my boat, one hand gripping the gunwale so tightly my fingers ached, the flashlight in my other hand pointing uselessly at the deck. I couldn't move. Couldn't speak. Could barely breathe. The creature made a sound. Low, resonant, felt more than heard. It vibrated through the water, through the hull of my boat, through my chest cavity. Not aggressive. Not threatening. Just communication. A sound that conveyed meaning I couldn't parse but somehow understood on an instinctive level. It was asking something. Or stating something. Or warning me about something. Then it moved closer. Stop. Right here. This is the moment that changed my life. The moment I stopped being a skeptic and became something else. If you're still listening, if you haven't dismissed this as fantasy or delusion, then subscribe now. Hit that like button if you believe some encounters can't be rationalized or explained. Because what happened next is why I never fished again. Why I couldn't. Why the thought of being on that water after dark makes my hands shake even now, 56 years later. The creature glided through the water without making a ripple, its body moving with sinuous grace beneath the surface. As it approached, I could see more of it, the massive body behind the neck, the suggestion of appendages that might have been flippers or might have been something else, the way it moved through the water with barely any visible effort. It stopped perhaps 3 meters from my boat. Close enough that I could have reached out and touched it if I'd been insane enough to try. Close enough that I could see the texture of its skin, see the old scars crossing its neck, see the barnacles or some other growth clustered near the waterline. And close enough that I could see something else. Something that made no sense at all. Around its neck, if you could call it a neck, was something that looked like a collar. Not natural. Not organic. But a band of material that was darker than the skin, that had markings on it, symbols or patterns that caught the light from my flashlight and seemed to glow faintly. I'm not sure how long we stayed like that. Me frozen in terror, the creature floating beside my boat, both of us watching each other across a gulf of species and understanding that should never have been bridged. Minutes, probably, though it felt like hours. Then the creature did something that made my blood run cold. It opened its mouth. The mouth was large, larger than I'd expected, lined with teeth that were flat and grinding rather than sharp and predatory. Herbivore teeth. Whatever this creature was, it didn't hunt fish or people. But that knowledge did nothing to calm my terror as that massive jaw opened wider and wider, revealing a throat that glowed with a soft, bioluminescent light. The light pulsed. Regular, rhythmic, like a heartbeat. And with each pulse, I felt something in my head. Not a sound. Not a voice. But a pressure. A presence. Something trying to communicate in a way my brain wasn't equipped to process. Images flashed through my mind. Not memories, I knew they weren't mine, but visions. I saw the loch as it had been thousands of years ago. Saw the ice retreating, the water rising, the land changing. Saw creatures, plural, not singular, living in the deeper waters, hunting, communicating, existing in ways that suggested intelligence and society. I saw the passages that had once connected the loch to the sea, saw them closing, saw the creatures trapped as the land shifted and the water became isolated. Saw most of them die. Saw the survivors changing, adapting, becoming something different than what they'd been. And I saw this one. The last one. Alone for longer than I could comprehend, watching as the world above changed, as humans came and went, as villages appeared and grew and modernized. Watching as boats became more numerous, as nets became more sophisticated, as the water itself began to change from pollution and warming. The creature was trying to tell me something. Trying to make me understand something. But I was too terrified, too overwhelmed, too unprepared for this kind of contact. The mouth closed. The light faded. The pressure in my head released, leaving me gasping and dizzy, my knees weak enough that I had to sit down on the deck before I fell. The creature watched me for a moment longer. Then it made that sound again, that low, resonant thrumming, and began to sink. Smoothly, gently, without creating any turbulence. Just descending back into the depths as if it had never been there at all. I sat on the deck of my boat, shaking and crying and trying to process what had just happened. The rational part of my brain insisted it wasn't real, that I'd hallucinated, that I'd fallen asleep and dreamed the whole thing. But I knew better. Could still feel the residue of that contact in my head, could still see the afterimage of that glowing throat when I closed my eyes. The creature was real. The visions were real. And I'd just been given a message I didn't understand by something that shouldn't exist. I don't remember starting the engine. Don't remember finding the key I'd dropped or navigating back to shore. The next clear memory I have is standing on the dock at Invermariston as dawn was breaking, my boat secured, my nets still in the water where I'd abandoned them. Catherine was waiting at the cottage when I got home. She took one look at my face and pulled me inside without asking questions. Made me tea, wrapped a blanket around my shoulders, let me sit by the fire until the shaking stopped. "What happened?" she finally asked. I tried to tell her. Tried to explain what I'd seen, what I'd experienced, what the creature had shown me. But the words wouldn't come out right. Everything I said sounded insane, even to my own ears. "You saw something," she said quietly. "Something real. Your father saw it too, didn't he? That's why he stopped fishing." I nodded, unable to speak. "Will you go back out?" "I don't know," I lied. I already knew the answer. I would never fish Loch Ness at night again. Possibly never fish it at all. The thought of being on that dark water, knowing what moved beneath it, knowing what was watching from the depths. I couldn't do it. "Then we'll find another way," Catherine said. "We'll manage. But you don't have to go back out there if you're not ready." I never was ready. Sold my boat within the month. Took a job at the fish processing plant in Fort Augustus. Indoor work, steady hours, no night shifts. It paid less than fishing, but I didn't care. At least I could sleep at night without dreaming of glowing throats and ancient eyes and visions of a world that no longer existed. But I couldn't leave the loch entirely. Couldn't move away, couldn't put distance between myself and what I'd seen. Because the creature's message, whatever it had been trying to tell me, stayed with me. Haunted me. Made me feel like I had some obligation I didn't understand, some responsibility I hadn't asked for. Over the years, I started researching. Quietly, carefully, without drawing attention. I collected stories from other fishermen who'd had strange encounters. I studied the history of the loch, the legends, the sightings. I tried to understand what the creature was, where it had come from, what it wanted. And slowly, piece by piece, I began to understand the message it had been trying to give me that night. The creature wasn't just showing me its history. It was showing me a warning. A plea. A desperate attempt to communicate something that I was too frightened and unprepared to understand at the time. Part 2 will reveal what I eventually learned, what the creature was trying to tell me, and why that message matters more now than ever before. For the first 5 years after the encounter, I tried to forget. Tried to convince myself it had been a hallucination, a dream, a trick of exhaustion and darkness. I went to work at the fish processing plant, came home to Catherine and the boys, lived as normal a life as I could manage. But the dreams wouldn't let me forget. Every night, sometimes multiple times a night, I'd wake up gasping, my head filled with those visions the creature had shown me. The ice retreating. The water rising. The creatures trapped and dying. And always, at the end, that glowing throat, that pulsing light, that sense of desperate urgency I hadn't understood in the moment. Catherine suggested I see a doctor. Trauma, she said gently. What you experienced was traumatic. There's no shame in getting help. But I didn't want help processing the trauma. I wanted to understand what had happened. I wanted to decode the message. Because I was becoming increasingly certain that it had been a message, not just a random sharing of memories. The creature had been trying to tell me something specific, something important. I started visiting the library in Inverness on my days off. Started reading everything I could find about Loch Ness, not the tourist nonsense, but the serious research. Geological surveys. Ecological studies. Archaeological reports. Historical records dating back centuries. And I found patterns. Disturbing patterns. Every few decades, there would be a spike in sightings. Not random sightings, but concentrated periods when multiple reliable witnesses reported seeing the creature. And these spikes always coincided with significant changes to the loch or the surrounding area. In the 1930s, when the A82 road was being built along the shore, there was a massive increase in sightings. In the 1950s, when industrial pollution from the villages was at its worst, another spike. In the 1960s, when tourism boats became more numerous and aggressive, yet another increase. The creature wasn't randomly appearing. It was responding to threats. Trying to get attention. Trying to communicate that something was wrong. I found other accounts of encounters similar to mine. Not many, most people didn't talk about the strange experiences they'd had, afraid of being ridiculed or dismissed as fantasists. But if you dug deep enough, if you talked to old fishermen in quiet pubs after dark, the stories emerged. A man in 1947 who'd been fishing at night and had seen the creature surface beside his boat. He'd felt something in his head, he said, like someone trying to talk to him in a language he didn't speak. He'd quit fishing the next day and never went back on the water. A woman in 1955 who'd been walking along the shore at dusk when the creature had surfaced near her. She'd heard a sound, she claimed, that made her understand things she couldn't explain. She'd spent the rest of her life campaigning for environmental protection of the loch, though she'd never told anyone why it mattered so much to her. A boy in 1962 who'd been swimming near Urquhart Bay when something large had passed beneath him. He'd felt images flood his mind, he said, visions of water and ice and creatures that no longer existed. He'd become a marine biologist, dedicated his career to studying freshwater ecosystems. The pattern was clear. The creature was trying to communicate. Was reaching out to humans in desperate attempts to convey something we needed to understand. It was the collar that finally gave me the key to understanding. That artificial-looking band around the creature's neck, covered in symbols that had glowed faintly in my flashlight beam. I dismissed it initially, convinced I'd imagined it or misidentified some natural marking. But in my dreams, in those visions that repeated night after night, I always saw it clearly. And the symbols on it always seemed to shift, to rearrange themselves, as if they were trying to tell me something. I started researching ancient symbols. Pictish stones, Celtic carvings, Norse runes, anything that might match what I'd seen. Nothing fit exactly, but there were similarities. Spiral patterns, geometric shapes, water symbols. In 1976, I met an archaeologist named Dr. Patricia Stone at a lecture about Neolithic sites in the Highlands. After the lecture, I approached her carefully, describing what I'd seen, not mentioning the creature, just the symbols, claiming I'd seen them carved on a stone near the loch. She studied my rough drawings for a long time. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. These aren't Pictish. They're older. Much older. And they're not Scottish at all. I've seen similar markings in only one other place, underwater ruins in the Mediterranean that predate any known civilization. Underwater ruins. There's evidence of settlements that were flooded when sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age. Cities, possibly. Civilizations that were drowned and forgotten. The symbols you've drawn here match patterns found at those sites. Where did you say you saw them? I couldn't tell her. Couldn't explain that I'd seen them on a creature that officially didn't exist. But that conversation changed everything for me. Because it meant the collar wasn't natural. It was artificial. Created by someone, with intelligence and purpose. This is crucial. Listen carefully. The creature in Loch Ness isn't just an animal. It's wearing something. Something made by a civilization that existed before the ice melted, before the modern world. If you're still with me, if you understand what that implies, then subscribe. Hit that like button if you believe human history is incomplete, that there are chapters we've forgotten or never knew. Because what I discovered next explains why the creature was so desperate to communicate. I spent the next decade researching flooded civilizations. Ruins beneath the Mediterranean, the North Sea, the Black Sea. Settlements that had been drowned when the glacier melted and sea levels rose by over 100 meters. And I found theories, dismissed by mainstream archaeology but supported by geological evidence, that Scotland had been inhabited during the Ice Age by peoples who'd built settlements in the valleys that would later become lochs. Loch Ness sat in one of those valleys. And if there had been a settlement there before the water came, if there had been people living alongside these creatures before the flood, then the collar made sense. It was a marker. A tag. Evidence of some relationship between humans and the creatures that had existed 10,000 years ago. But if that was true, then what was the creature trying to tell me? What message was so important that it had been trying to communicate it to random humans for decades? The answer came in 1988, when I read a report about water quality in Loch Ness. The report showed increasing pollution levels, rising temperatures, declining oxygen content in the deep water. The loch was dying. Slowly but measurably, the water was becoming less able to support the life that depended on it. And suddenly, I understood. The creature's message, the desperate urgency in those telepathic visions, the reason it kept surfacing and trying to communicate despite the risk, it was dying. The last of its kind, trapped in water that was slowly becoming uninhabitable, and it was trying to tell us. Trying to warn us. Trying to ask for help in the only way it could. Once I understood, I tried to do something about it. Tried to warn people that the loch was in trouble, that the pollution and the warming and the tourist boats were creating conditions that couldn't sustain the ecosystem, or the creature that was part of it. I wrote letters to environmental organizations, to government agencies, to newspapers. I never mentioned the creature specifically. I'd learned that lesson from my research into others who'd tried. But I provided data, cited the water quality reports, made the case that Loch Ness needed protection. Most of my letters were ignored. A few received polite responses thanking me for my concern and assuring me that the matter was being monitored. None resulted in any meaningful action. I tried to organize local fishermen to create pressure for better environmental regulations. But most of them were struggling to make a living and didn't want to support restrictions that might further limit their ability to work the loch. I attended council meetings, spoke at public forums, did everything I could think of to draw attention to the problem. And people listened politely, thanked me for my passion, and did nothing. Because I couldn't tell them the real reason it mattered. Couldn't explain that there was a creature in the loch that had been there for thousands of years, that was the last survivor of something ancient and irreplaceable, that was dying because we were changing its habitat too fast for it to adapt. If I'd told them that, they would have dismissed me as a crank. Would have stopped listening to anything I said. So I stuck to the scientific arguments, the environmental data, the rational case for protecting the loch. And it wasn't enough. By the late 1990s, I'd given up trying to save the loch through official channels. The pollution continued. The water warmed. The tourist boats multiplied. And I could only watch, helpless and frustrated, knowing what was happening but unable to stop it. Catherine died in 2003. Cancer, like what's taking me now. Her last words to me were, "You tried. That's what matters. You tried to help." But trying wasn't enough. The creature had asked for help, and I'd failed to provide it. I saw the creature one more time, 36 years after our first encounter. It was October 2004, early evening, and I was walking along the shore near Invermariston, something I did most evenings, drawn to the water despite the memories it held. The light was fading, the air cold with the promise of winter. The loch was empty of boats, the tourist season over, the water returning to the quiet solitude it had known for millennia before humans decided it was theirs to exploit. And there, perhaps 50 meters from shore, I saw its surface. Older. I could tell even at that distance. The neck moved more slowly, the head drooped slightly, the whole bearing suggested exhaustion rather than the grace I remembered from 1968. It saw me, turned its head toward the shore, toward where I stood frozen on the beach. And I felt it again, that pressure in my head, that attempt at communication. But this time, there were no visions. No complex messages. Just a single overwhelming emotion. Resignation. The creature knew it was dying. Knew the loch could no longer sustain it. Knew that despite its attempts to communicate, despite its desperate efforts to make humans understand, nothing had changed. We'd continued polluting, warming, filling its home with noise and boats and chemicals until it could no longer survive there. And it wanted me to know that it understood. That it didn't blame me. That I'd tried, and trying mattered even when it failed. I stood on that beach with tears streaming down my face, watching the last survivor of an ancient species, and feeling the weight of failure settle on my shoulders like a physical burden. The creature held my gaze for perhaps a minute. Then it made that sound, that low, resonant thrumming I'd heard only once before, 36 years ago in the darkness of a September night. A sound that conveyed farewell and forgiveness and a profound sadness that transcended species and language. Then it sank beneath the surface. Slowly. Peacefully. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that I would never see it again. I haven't. No one has, as far as I can determine. There have been no credible sightings since 2004. No reliable reports. No evidence that the creature still lives in Loch Ness. And I believe it's gone. Died, or left, or simply retreated so deep into the loch that it will never surface again. Subscribe if you understand what we've lost. Hit that like button if you believe this testimony matters. Share this with everyone, because the world needs to know what happened here. What we allowed to happen. I've spent the 20 years since then waiting. Watching. Hoping for one more glimpse, one more sign that the creature survived. But there's been nothing. Just silence. The same silence that preceded its first appearance in my life, but now empty rather than pregnant with possibility. The loch is quieter than it used to be. The fish populations have declined. The water quality continues to deteriorate. And something essential, something ancient and irreplaceable, is gone from these waters. I'm the last person alive who had direct contact with the creature. Who felt its thoughts in my head, who understood what it was trying to tell us, who carries the weight of its final message. And now I'm dying too. The cancer is spreading, the doctors are out of options, and I have perhaps weeks left rather than months. This recording is my testament. My final attempt to fulfill the responsibility the creature gave me that night in 1968, whether I wanted it or not. The creature in Loch Ness was real. Not a monster, not a myth, not a tourist attraction. It was the last survivor of a species that had lived alongside ancient humans, that had worn a collar made by a civilization that drowned 10,000 years ago, that had tried desperately to communicate with modern humans about the dying of its world. And we failed it. I failed it. Despite understanding the message, despite decades of trying to get people to listen, despite knowing what was at stake, I couldn't save it. Couldn't even convince people that saving it mattered. The collar is the key to understanding. Someone needs to find it. If the creature died in the loch, if its body is down there in the deep water, then the collar is still there. Still intact, still bearing those symbols that connect us to a lost civilization, still holding proof that our history is incomplete and our arrogance is unearned. Someone needs to search the deep water near Urquhart Castle. That's where I encountered the creature in 1968, and that's where it surfaced for the last time in 2004. If it died, it likely died there, in the deep trench where it had lived for so long. Find the collar. Study the symbols. Understand what they represent. And maybe then, finally, someone will believe that the creature was real, that the message was urgent, that we had a chance to save something irreplaceable and we chose not to. I'm not asking for vindication. I'm past caring whether people believe my story. I'm asking for recognition. For acknowledgement that something precious existed in these waters, that it reached out to us for help, that it died because we weren't listening. My sons know about this recording. They've promised to release it after I'm gone, to make sure it gets uploaded somewhere public where it can't be suppressed or dismissed. They don't entirely believe my story, how could they? They never saw the creature, never felt its thoughts, never carried the burden of its message. But they believe that I believe. And that's enough for them to honor my final request. This is the end of my testimony. William Grant, speaking from Invermariston, Scotland, in December 2024. I have weeks to live, and I've spent 56 years carrying a secret I couldn't fully share, a message I couldn't make people hear, a failure I can't escape. But maybe this recording will accomplish what I couldn't in life. Maybe someone listening will understand. We'll care. We'll recognize that we share this world with things older and stranger than we imagine, and that when they reach out to us, when they ask for help, we have an obligation to listen. Subscribe to this channel to keep this testimony alive, to ensure it's not forgotten or dismissed. Hit that like button if you believe the creature deserves to be remembered, even if it's gone. Share this with scientists, with environmentalists, with anyone who has the resources to search for the collar, to prove I'm telling the truth. The night the Scottish fisherman was surprised by the Loch Ness Monster wasn't just an encounter. It was a warning, a plea, a final attempt by something ancient to connect with something young, to bridge the gulf between species, to ask for compassion and help. I failed to provide that help. But maybe you won't. Search the deep water near Urquhart Castle. Find the collar. Prove the creature existed. Honor its memory. And learn from my failure. Learn to listen when the impossible tries to speak. Learn to act when the ancient asks for help. Learn that sharing this world means protecting it, all of it, even the parts we don't understand. The creature is gone, but its message remains. Please, don't let it have died for nothing. William Grant died on January 8, 2025, at home in Invermariston, surrounded by his family. This recording was found on his computer and uploaded to multiple platforms by his sons, as he had requested. In February 2025, an expedition team began deep-water exploration near Urquhart Castle, funded by anonymous donors who'd heard Grant's testimony. They reported finding unusual metallic objects at a depth of approximately 230 meters. As of this writing, the objects are being analyzed. The results have not been made public. Whether William Grant's testimony will be vindicated remains to be seen. But his final message, that we must listen when the impossible tries to speak, deserves to be heard. And remembered. And honored.